Kia ora tātou. Ko David Hall tōku ingoa. It's great to be here, thank you. And so, I do nature-based solutions, and I'm going to tell a story today, a tale about two forestry regimes, the incumbent and the niche. The incumbent regime is this one. It constitutes nearly 90% of our productive planted forests. Pinus radiata, exotic monoculture forests managed as an even-age class, harvested by clear fell systems harvesting. The second is a niche regime. Indeed, so niche, it doesn't really show up in industry statistics. It's a productive forest here in the picture, but with native species, totara in particular. And this sort of opens the door to a possible pathway to close to nature forestry, using continuous cover forestry systems to manage diverse native species in an uneven age class, selectively harvested. The totara industry pilot shows that this system is economically viable, and if it's economically viable, then it's potentially scalable. So if we get this right, we could achieve the Climate Change Commission's ambition of ramping up native afforestation to 300,000 hectares by 2035. Now, I made similar recommendations to the Commission back in 2016 when I published Our Forest Future report for Pure Advantage, which also fed a little into Trees That Count. It was a much lonelier place to be back then, and I know some of the arguments against this kinds of forestry system, because I received many bullish emails over that time telling me it ain't going to happen, often with much of the forestry sector itself CC'd into them. So I know what it's like to be a slightly younger person with different ideas about ways forward. The reasons for it not being viable that I hear: firstly, native forests cost too much up front because the establishment costs are too high. Second, there isn't enough certainty around markets, supply chains and financial returns. And thirdly, native species grow too slow, so can't bring in sufficient revenue from carbon or timber on investable timelines. Now, I'm not a forester, so I do defer to what foresters say about what can and can't be done within the current system. There are real constraints that need to be taken seriously. However, I research policy, politics, and sustainability transitions, and what I can say is that we should not treat the current system as inevitable or removable. We can change the structure of our markets and our policy systems. We've done this before, and we can do it again. And so here, I'm going to talk a little bit about the science of transitions, using the example of the energy transition, which is already underway. And I'm going to introduce the idea of the experience curve. These are experience curves. They don't look like curves, but this is because it's a logarithmic graph. So it's showing exponential improvements in the cost efficiency of renewable energy over the last decade. On the x-axis, we have cumulative deployment of renewable energy capacity, and on the y-axis, the levelized cost of electricity, so the average net present cost of electricity generation over the lifetime of the generating asset, whether it's a wind turbine or solar PV panel. And as you can see, the more these technologies are deployed in the real world, the cheaper they get. That's the experience curve. The more we deploy something at scale, the more we learn about how to produce and install it more efficiently and effectively. So you can see on the right there, onshore wind and solar PV are now competing against fossil fuels. They're now the cheapest forms of electricity in human history. Concentrating solar and offshore wind is close behind, and lots of runway for further improvement. So this is one of the happy stories of the climate crisis, that the energy transition already has irreversible momentum. And this is the first lesson to learn from a transition. The more we do something, the easier and cheaper it becomes to do, because we improve our capabilities, we finesse our routines, we exploit efficiencies, and eventually we build economy of scale that drive costs down. Experience curves tend to happen for technologies which are mass-produced, so it isn't relevant for all aspects of forestry, but when it comes to nursery management and propagation in particular, mass production is indeed the name of the game. And Adam Thompson's talk yesterday showed a little bit the ways that we might have some confidence that when we start actually ramping up, we can drive down the upfront costs of native forest establishment, just like we did for Pinus radiata once upon a time. But a transition requires more than just refining and improving new ways of doing things. It also needs to compete with existing technologies and practices, and that's the second lesson from the energy transition. To scale up new ways of doing things, we need to scale back the conventional way of doing things. In the case of forestry, I don't think the aim of the game is to phase out Pinus radiata completely in the same way that we have to phase out fossil fuels more or less completely, because Pinus radiata forests do have a really valuable role in the net zero future as a source of mass timber for building and construction, and also a feedstock for the burgeoning bioeconomy. However, we do need to make sure that one forestry system does not crowd out other diverse opportunities in forestry by hoarding all the available land, all the available capital and research funding, all the available workforce and infrastructure. So how do we make space for natives, which was the title of this talk? And here's another view of the transition process developed by the innovation theorist Frank Yiels. And he emphasizes that transitions aren't driven merely by the emergence of innovation, but because change occurs across three levels: the niche, the regime, and the landscape. The niche is the level where the innovations emerge. The regime is the level of the incumbents, the prevailing institutions and policy, markets, culture, science, and so on. And the landscape is the wider context, the megatrends which occur in society and the environment, such as changing public attitudes and global heating itself. What this graph makes clear is that we need more than new ideas and practices. We need to scale them up to go from niche to mainstream. Now, some innovations won't scale up because they're not useful, because they don't create real value. But some innovations are useful and are value creating, and yet they don't scale up for the arbitrary reason that the incumbent regime won't make space for that innovation. So an innovation like close to nature forestry might not get a foothold in the mainstream industry because of market barriers, regulatory misalignment, lack of enabling infrastructure, consumer misperceptions, etc. And this is a lost opportunity for the creation of public value. It comes at a severe opportunity cost. So the lesson here is that if change is going to happen, we need to destabilize the status quo just enough to make space for alternatives. Some of that destabilization happens at the landscape level at the top there. So some examples are, the recent decline for social license for plantation forestry triggered by slash and debris events. That opens up people's minds to new alternatives. Also, we're going to see a lot more severe and frequent fire weather across the East Coast in coming years and decades, and that's going to put pressure on conventional systems. And another is the public's renewed sense of importance for biodiversity, driven, by Trees That Count and other organisations which are reconnecting people with nature and mobilising support for native forests. All these trends put pressure on the incumbent regime, raise awareness of their contradictions, and create windows of opportunity for new ways of doing things. This destabilisation of the incumbent regime can also happen from the inside, as institutional actors like business leaders and policy entrepreneurs working within government agencies, again, create windows of opportunity for innovators to enter, to get a leg up into the mainstream. So, for example, I was involved in the Aotearoa Circle Sustainable Finance Forum with the financial sector. We talked a lot about how the financial system has risk and return expectations that are excessively short-sighted, short-termist. Conventional investment analysis uses high discount rates, which massively downgrade the future value of forests, especially those on longer rotations. And it's not clear that those discount rates actually reflect the risks of other kinds of forestry systems. Conventional business models also track quantifiable financial return, but often struggle to capture the wider set of social and environmental values like erosion control, landscape resilience, let alone our aesthetic and spiritual attachments to native forests. So through sustainable finance reform, through revisiting discount rates and investment frameworks by putting an emphasis on impact over mere profit, the incumbents can create openings for new impact-driven business models, potentially even including native forestry models. And the third lesson of the energy transition is that policy is critical in all of this. And because we're navigating multiple objectives, we need policy mixes, not just single policy instruments which just focus on one objective. And that's something that Adam alluded to with the emissions trading scheme. It's a great machine for least cost mitigation and carbon sequestration, but that's only one thing we're trying to do here. And so we need other instruments which are tackling other parts of the challenge. For early stage innovation, strategic investments are critical, including direct support for innovation. Targeted R&D funding is vital, and I acknowledge the major commitment to native forestry that was made by the government in this year's budget. But really, we need RD and D funding, research, development, and deployment, because as I said earlier, it's deployment that pushes a technology along the experience curve. If the government invested in a series of well-monitored demonstration forests around the country, even at a high initial cost, there is good reason to believe that this will build up capabilities and drive down costs for all of the future. Expensive policy options and high abatement costs can sometimes make sense, especially in the context of a transition and transformation. As the new technology matures, then market design becomes increasingly important, including the pricing of so-called externalities. And we already have a carbon price through the ETS, which is increasingly meaningful through ETS reforms. But of course, it leaves native species at a disadvantage because they generally start out slower growing than Pinus radiata. From an investor perspective, this lack of liquid cash flow over the first couple of decades is a major investment barrier. But this is also where the biodiversity gains are greatest as native species establish themselves, substitute exotic grasses and shrubs, and create natural habitat. If a biodiversity payment could be made over the first 10 or 15 years to bridge the gap in early cash flow until native forests start to ramp up their carbon gains, then we have a far more viable business case. And this would be time limited in that sense. It's just that biodiversity payment at that critical point which caps the liability for whoever is paying. I say biodiversity payments as well, just as an aside, because biodiversity and credits, to my mind, implies biodiversity offsetting, and offsetting is just one way of delivering a payment. I think there's a multitude of different financial instruments that could deliver a payment, and you only need to look at what's going on in Australia with the Commission on the biodiversity offsetting scheme over there to see some of the regulatory challenges of that particular instrument. My favourite option is an environmental footprint tax, which taxes intensive land uses and then recycles a payment to nature-based solutions, but dreams are free. There are other ways to shape markets to support native forestry. John Dronfield showed yesterday some data which suggested that timber imports have taken up market share that native timbers might have otherwise occupied. You know, these are strategic choices that we make as a country, and if we were a little more discriminating about what we allow to be imported in, then, you know, what thorny problems might get easier to solve for establishing native forests. And markets can also be strengthened by procurement decisions, both from the public and private sector, especially forward commitments to purchase native timber, which reduces uncertainties for foresters. And this feeds into the norms and behaviour, the standards which lock in the new system when a technology is more mature and more established, through public education campaigns, community commitments to wood-first principles for new construction, the realignment of building standards to support domestic timbers. All of this can help those technologies to prosper. The key for the policy mix is to explore interventions along the whole pathway from start to finish to address actual barriers and ideally to create synergies that reinforce each other. And then my final slide and my final lesson here. When analysing transition barriers, be careful about who you listen to. This graph comes from Sweden, which is having a similar conversation actually about whether they relying too much on clear-cut systems and whether they should be making continuous cover forestry systems a greater part of the overall forestry sector. And in this study, researchers asked stakeholders where the barriers to continuous cover forestry were. The niche advocates of continuous cover forestry had one perspective. As you can see here, they put the emphasis on the prevailing culture in the forestry sector, the power of existing industrial networks, and current forestry education as the major barriers to upscaling continuous cover forestry. The incumbents, however, the people who were involved in the clearfell sector, had a very different view. They thought the greatest barriers to continuous cover forestry were ecological risks, low economic profitability, and a lack of technical knowledge about CCF as reasons for its limited uptake. And you can see the CCF foresters didn't agree with them on that. In whose perspective do we trust here? Do we trust the people with skin in the game who are already practicing continuous cover forestry? Or do we trust the people who are invested in the status quo, who continue to benefit from the way things happen to be? You can probably tell what I think. So I'll leave you with one final thought, a very political thought, that the greatest levers for change are, firstly, changing mindsets, and second, shifting power. Ngā mihi kia ora koutou.